Girl sees a millionaire passed out, becoming prey for a giant snake, so she does this. Comment what you thought of this story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and get to know you better, so please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scorching Appalachian sun beat down relentlessly on the dirt road that snaked through the North Carolina mountains. Arthur Blackwood, 58, adjusted the air conditioning in his Mercedes as he drove back to Asheville after a frustrating meeting with suppliers in Hendersonville. As the owner of Blackwood Gems, one of the most respected gemstone houses in the state, he was used to handling business setbacks, but that morning had been particularly draining. His suppliers were delaying deliveries, and the pressure to maintain the quality he had built over 3 decades of work weighed increasingly on his shoulders. Lost in thoughts of spreadsheets and deadlines, Arthur didn't notice when he began to feel dizzy. The road seemed to ripple before his eyes, and a strange tingling sensation took over his arms. A diabetic for 15 years, he knew how to recognize the signs of a hypoglycemic episode, but this time it was different, more intense, more frightening. The car veered off the road and came to an abrupt stop beside a wire fence, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Arthur tried to reach for the emergency kit in the glove compartment, but his hands wouldn't obey his brain's commands. Consciousness began to slip away slowly, like water through clenched fingers. His last conscious memories were of the suffocating heat inside the vehicle and the distant sound of crickets chirping among the dry forest vegetation. It was then that he lost his senses completely. Amethyst had spent the morning searching for colorful pebbles along the rural road, an activity she did whenever she could escape the bustle of downtown Asheville. At 4 years old, with brown hair tousled by the wind and a faded pink dress she had found at a charity bazaar, she possessed a natural curiosity that led her to explore every corner of the mountainous region she called home. She had no known family. She had been living on the streets for months, sleeping under the awnings of closed shops or on benches in the central square, surviving on the occasional kindness of merchants who offered her leftover food. Her only clear memory was of an elderly woman she called Grandma Eleanor, who had disappeared during the confusion of the mountain dance and folk festival, leaving her completely alone in the world. When she saw the car stopped strangely on the road, Amethyst approached with a child's typical curiosity. Through the glass, she could see a man in a dark suit passed out in the driver's seat. But what truly paralyzed her with terror was what was on the hood of the vehicle, a boa constrictor at least 10 feet long, its thick, muscular body gleaming under the afternoon sun. The snake had been attracted by the heat of the engine and was now resting peacefully on the warm metal, completely oblivious to the human drama unfolding nearby. For any adult, this would have been a desperate situation. For Amethyst, it was a moment of pure instinct. Without hesitation, the little girl approached the back of the car and, in a move that defied all logic, firmly grabbed the boa's tail. The snake, surprised by the sudden disturbance, turned its triangular head toward the small intruder, but Amethyst did not retreat. With a determination inexplicable for someone so young, she pulled the tail with all the force her thin arms could muster. The snake, more annoyed than threatened, slowly slid off the hood and headed for the denser vegetation, clearing the way. Amethyst stood motionless for a few seconds, watching the snake disappear among the rocks, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Only then did she turn to the unconscious man in the car. Arthur awoke to the sensation of small hands shaking his shoulder. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but when he opened his eyes and saw the angelic face of a little girl looking at him through the slightly open window, reality hit him like a shock. "Are you okay, mister?" Amethyst asked, her small voice filled with genuine concern. "There was a big snake on your car, but it went away." It took Arthur a few seconds to process the words. Snake? What snake? He tried to move and felt the familiar discomfort after a hypoglycemic crisis, but he was alive and apparently unharmed. He looked at the girl again, noticing her worn-out clothes, her hair that clearly hadn't seen a comb in days, and especially the large, intelligent eyes that watched him with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. You helped me?" he asked, trying to understand how such a small child had gotten there in the middle of nowhere. Amethyst nodded shyly. "The snake was sleeping on your car. I pulled its tail to make it go away. My grandma Eleanor always said we shouldn't hurt animals, just ask them to move out of the way." Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude for whatever this girl had done to help him. It was something deeper, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Since becoming a widower 8 years earlier, he had closed himself off in his work, keeping an emotional distance even from his daughter, Iris. But there was something in those childish eyes that touched a part of his soul he thought was forever dormant. "Where are your parents, little one?" he asked, slowly getting out of the car and steadying himself against the bodywork. "I don't have parents," Amethyst replied with devastating simplicity. "I only had my grandma, but she disappeared during the festival. Now I live in the square in Asheville." Arthur felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. A 4-year-old child living alone on the streets? In his years as a successful businessman, he had occasionally contributed to charities, but he had never come face to face with real human suffering. And there it was, right in front of him, in the form of a brave little girl who had just saved his life. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to be at the child's level. "Amethyst," she replied, and then shyly added, "Like the purple stone my grandma showed me. She said it was special." Arthur almost lost his balance. Amethyst, the name of one of the most valued gemstones in his business, and the mention of a grandmother who knew stones made him think of the thousands of prospectors and small miners he had met over the years. Could it be just a coincidence? "Listen, Amethyst," he said, making a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "You saved me today. And now I'd like to return the favor. How about I take you to have a bath and something hot to eat, and then we can talk about finding your grandma?" Amethyst's eyes lit up with a hope she hadn't felt in months. "Are you going to help me find Grandma Eleanor?" "I'll do what I can," Arthur promised, holding out his hand to the girl. "First, let's take care of you. Is that okay?" Amethyst hesitated for only a moment before accepting the outstretched hand. It was the first time in months that someone had offered her genuine security, and something in her childish instinct told her she could trust this kind man who spoke to her as if she were important. During the drive to Asheville, Amethyst remained glued to the window, watching the familiar mountains. Arthur, still processing what had happened, drove in silence, casting occasional glances at the girl in the rearview mirror. "Amethyst," he said finally, "weren't you afraid of the snake?" The girl turned to him, her eyes reflecting a premature wisdom. "My grandma taught me that animals only hurt you when they're scared. The snake was just resting." Arthur was impressed. In his 58 years, he had never met anyone who spoke of dangerous serpents with such tranquility. Let alone a 4-year-old child. At St. Vincent's Hospital, the Sunday traffic was calm. Arthur parked and observed Amethyst's physical state under the bright light. The child was visibly dehydrated, her chapped lips betraying days without proper care. "Let's get you taken care of first," he said, picking her up in his arms. Amethyst didn't resist, but Arthur could feel how her small body was tense, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. At the reception, a nurse named Constance arranged for priority care while a social worker named Fiona was called to assess the case. During the initial medical examination, a strange discovery emerged. Amethyst, despite her malnutrition, showed a peculiar knowledge of medicinal plants from the region, mentioning technical names that not even pharmacists knew. "How does she know that?" Constance whispered to Arthur. "Her grandma taught her," he replied, increasingly intrigued by the mysteries surrounding the child. When they got into the Mercedes and headed for Asheville, neither Arthur nor Amethyst imagined that this chance encounter would trigger a series of discoveries that would shake everything they thought they knew about their own lives. The snake Amethyst had shooed away was just the first of many obstacles they would have to face together. 2 hours later, Amethyst was unrecognizable. Fiona, the social worker, had managed to find clean clothes that fit her, and after a full bath at the hospital, the girl revealed silky brown hair and skin that, despite the pallor of malnutrition, had a natural golden tone. More importantly, the intravenous drip had brought life back to her large eyes, which now observed everything around with renewed curiosity. Arthur watched the transformation with a mixture of emotions he couldn't name. There was something deeply moving in seeing this child recover her basic dignity, but also a sharp pain in thinking about how many other children were going through the same hardships at that very moment. "Mr. Blackwood," Fiona said, approaching with a folder of documents, "I need to talk to you about the next steps. Amethyst will need to stay here at the hospital for observation for at least one more night, but then we'll need a temporary solution for her custody." Arthur nodded, although a part of him already knew what his answer would be. "I would like to take temporary responsibility for her while we search for her grandmother." Fiona watched him carefully. "Do you understand that this would involve a complete social investigation? We would need to visit your residence, verify your financial and personal conditions, speak with references." "I understand perfectly," Arthur replied. "Do whatever is necessary." While the adults talked about bureaucracy, Amethyst had become interested in a small stone she found in the pocket of her dirty dress. It was just a common quartz, the kind you could find anywhere in the gem-rich region, but she held it with reverence, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "That's pretty," commented child psychologist Rachel Hill, who had arrived to do a preliminary assessment of the child. "Where did you find it?" "On the road, when I found the man," Amethyst replied, showing the stone to Rachel. "It's like the ones my grandma used to collect. She said that stones keep stories." Rachel was immediately interested. In her 15 years working with traumatized children, she had learned that attachment objects often revealed important clues about the little patient's pasts. "What kind of stories?" Amethyst closed her eyes for a moment, as if remembering something very distant. "Stories from when the earth was new and big animals lived here. Grandma said that every stone has a special color inside, and that some people can see that color just by touching it." Arthur, who had stopped talking to Fiona to listen, felt a shiver run down his spine. Throughout his career as a jeweler, he had only met 3 people capable of identifying the quality of precious stones by touch alone, without any equipment. It was a rare, almost mythical talent that appeared perhaps once a generation among the most experienced prospectors. "Amethyst," he said, crouching beside the girl, "can you feel the special color of this stone?" The girl took the quartz and wrapped it completely in her small hands. She closed her eyes and remained silent for almost a minute. When she opened them again, there was a look of disappointment on her face. "This one doesn't have a special color," she said sadly. "It's just a common little stone. But Grandma taught me that even common stones have value because they protect the special ones." Rachel and Fiona exchanged intrigued glances, but Arthur felt as if he had received an electric shock. Not only had Amethyst demonstrated an extraordinary ability to evaluate stones, but her Explanation about common quartz protecting precious stones was technically correct. That was exactly how quartz veins worked in nature, sheltering and protecting formations of rarer stones. At that moment, the room door opened and a nurse entered with some test results. The doctor requested a blood analysis to check for nutritional deficiencies, she said, handing a paper to Rachel. As the psychologist examined the results, a look of confusion spread across her face. "This is strange," she murmured. "Her iron and vitamin levels are low, as expected. But there are some very specific deficiencies that aren't common in simple malnutrition cases." "What does that mean?" Arthur asked, concerned. "It means Amethyst likely had access to a very specific diet before she was on her own. These deficiencies are typical of people living in mining regions, where the water and soil have a particular mineral composition." Fiona frowned. "There are many mining areas in the region, but most don't allow children. She would have had to live in a very isolated place." Amethyst, who had been listening to the adults' conversation intently, suddenly brightened. "I remember Grandma's house. It was near a big hole in the ground where she worked looking for stones, and there was a huge tree with yellow flowers in front. A tulip poplar," Arthur said immediately. "There are several old mines in the region that have century-old poplars. Some were abandoned decades ago." "Grandma always said our house was special because it was on top of a treasure," Amethyst continued, her eyes shining with the memories. "She dug every day, but not to get rich. It was to protect the treasure from the bad men." Rachel leaned forward, interested. "What bad men, dear?" "The ones who wanted to take Grandma's stones without paying. They came in a big car and spoke roughly to her, but Grandma was smart and hid the most beautiful stones where they would never look." Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. Amethyst's description perfectly matched the modus operandi of groups that exploited independent prospectors, offering ridiculously low prices for valuable stones or, in extreme cases, simply taking the claims by force. There had been rumors in the region about these groups for years, but he had never been able to prove them. "Amethyst," he said carefully, "do you remember how your grandmother disappeared during the festival?" The girl was quiet for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "Grandma was very tired that day. She was saying strange things, like she was talking to people who weren't there. When we got to the festival, there were so many people and so much noise. Grandma got confused and started walking in the wrong direction. I tried to hold on to her, but she was too fast. When I looked again, she was gone." Fiona and Rachel exchanged significant glances. The description suggested signs of dementia or Alzheimer's, which would explain both the disappearance and the difficulty in locating the child through official channels. "How long ago did this happen?" Fiona asked. "Many days," Amethyst replied vaguely. "I slept in the square for many nights. Sometimes people gave me food, but no one ever wanted to take me home." Arthur felt a mixture of anger and sadness. How had an entire city allowed a 4-year-old child to wander the streets for weeks? But he knew he couldn't judge. Until that morning, he himself had spent years isolating himself from the suffering around him. "Mr. Blackwood," Rachel said, "we need to talk about expectations. Cases like this can drag on for months. Amethyst may have family we haven't been able to locate yet, or her grandmother might reappear. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" Arthur looked at Amethyst, who had gone back to playing with her common quartz, quietly humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby. There was something about that scene that touched a part of his soul he thought was dead since he lost his wife. It wasn't just compassion or a sense of duty. It was something deeper, more primitive. It was as if this child had awakened a paternal instinct in him that he never knew he possessed. "I'm prepared," he said firmly. "I will take care of her for as long as it takes." That night, While Amethyst slept in her hospital bed, Arthur drove to his mansion in the hills with more questions than answers. The house that had been his silent refuge for years suddenly felt too big and empty. There were other worries weighing on his mind. He still hadn't spoken to his daughter, Iris, about Amethyst, and he knew that conversation wouldn't be easy. Iris had become bitter since her divorce, and seeing her father take on responsibility for a strange child would surely spark conflict. More disturbing were Amethyst's stories about men intimidating her grandmother. If groups were exploiting vulnerable prospectors, it would explain why locating Eleanor was proving so difficult. When he got home, Arthur poured himself a whiskey and sat on the porch, looking at the city lights stretching out in the valley below. Tomorrow, his life would change completely. For the first time in years, he would have someone other than himself to worry about. The next morning brought a storm Arthur hadn't anticipated. Iris Blackwood arrived at her father's mansion at 7 o'clock sharp, with a scowl on her face and a folder of documents under her arm. At 35, she had inherited her father's iron will, but also a bitterness that had grown like a weed since she lost custody of her son Thomas to her ex-husband 2 years ago. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, entering the house without waiting for an invitation. "I heard from the hospital that you've taken responsibility for an unknown child. Is that true?" Arthur sighed, pouring coffee for them both in the spacious kitchen. He had hoped to have more time to prepare for this conversation, but he knew that in a city the size of Asheville, news traveled fast. "It's true. The girl saved me from a dangerous situation yesterday. She has no known family." "Dad, you're 58 years old." Iris slammed the folder on the marble countertop. "You can't just decide to adopt a street kid on impulse. Have you thought about the legal implications, the financial ones? What if she has mental health issues? What if her family shows up and sues you?" "Iris, she's a 4-year-old child who was living alone on the streets," Arthur replied, trying to stay calm. "I couldn't just ignore it." "Of course you could have." Iris's voice rose an octave. "There are institutions for that. The state is responsible for these children, not you. You have a company to run, commitments, a structured life." Arthur studied his daughter's face and saw beyond the superficial anger. There was pain there, fear of being replaced, of losing another important person in her life. Since the contentious divorce, Iris had clung to her work at the company as her only source of emotional stability. "This has nothing to do with you," he said gently. "You are still my daughter, my partner, in the company. Amethyst is a temporary situation." "Amethyst?" Iris laughed bitterly. "She even has a gemstone name. How convenient for a sentimental jeweler." Just then, Arthur's phone rang. It was Fiona from the hospital, with news that would completely change the course of the conversation. "Mr. Blackwood, something interesting happened this morning." Amethyst woke up very agitated, talking about dreams of her grandmother. "She drew something we'd like you to see before you pick her up." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Arthur replied. Iris accompanied him to the hospital, maintaining a frosty silence the entire way. When they arrived at Amethyst's room, they found the girl sitting on the bed, surrounded by sheets of paper filled with crayon drawings. "Look, Mr. Arthur," Amethyst said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I dreamed about Grandma and she showed me where the guardian snakes live." Arthur approached the drawings and felt a chill run down his spine. They weren't ordinary childish scribbles. They were detailed maps, showing rock formations, paths between mountains, and most notably, several depictions of snakes intertwined around what were clearly crystals or precious stones. Rachel, who was observing the scene with professional interest, explained she woke up at 5 in the morning, talking about a very vivid dream. She asked for paper and crayons and began drawing compulsively. Dr. Santos was intrigued by the level of detail. "The snakes aren't mean," Amethyst said, pointing to her drawings. "They protect Grandma's treasure from the bad men. Grandma taught me that where there's a snake, there's a special stone." Iris, who had been silent until then, approached the drawings with skepticism. But when she saw the accuracy of the maps, her expression changed. As the administrator of the jewelry company, she knew the mining region well. Those drawings showed real geographical locations. "Dad, this looks like the area around Hawk's Peak," she said, pointing to one of the papers. "And this rock formation. I know this place. It's near the old Soares family mines." Arthur examined the drawings more closely. If Iris was right, Amethyst had mapped an area known for its high-quality amethyst deposits, but which had been considered depleted for decades. "Amethyst," he said carefully. "Have you been to these places you've drawn?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Grandma used to take me to see the guardian snakes. She said they knew all the secrets of the earth. Sometimes they would show where the prettiest stones were." Rachel frowned. "It's possible she has real memories mixed with fantastical elements. Children this age often create complex narratives to process traumatic experiences." But Arthur wasn't so sure it was fantasy. During his years in the jewelry business, he had met veteran prospectors who swore that snakes were natural indicators of rich mineral veins. The scientific explanation was that snakes took refuge in rock crevices where the temperature was more stable, the exact same places where precious stones tended to form. "Mr. Blackwood," Fiona said, "there's another matter we need to discuss. We received a call this morning about an elderly woman found disoriented in Brevard, about 50 miles from here. The physical description matches Amethyst's grandmother." Arthur's heart leapt. "Is she okay?" "She's been admitted to the hospital in Brevard for observation. Apparently, she suffers from advanced dementia and can't provide coherent information about her identity or whereabouts, but she has repeatedly mentioned the name Amethyst." Amethyst, who had overheard the conversation, dropped her crayons. "They found Grandma Eleanor." "It could be, sweetie," Fiona said gently. "We'll need you to come with us to make an identification." The trip to Brevard was tense and filled with expectation. Amethyst alternated between excitement and nervousness, while Iris remained silent, processing the implications of everything she had witnessed. Arthur drove carefully along the winding road, his mind racing with possibilities. At the hospital in Brevard, they found a woman of about 70, with disheveled white hair and eyes that alternated between lucidity and confusion. When Amethyst entered the room, the reaction was immediate and devastating. "My little Amethyst!" the woman cried, extending her trembling arms. "I looked for you everywhere. The snakes told me you were safe, but I couldn't remember where." Amethyst ran into her grandmother's arms, and they both began to cry. It was a scene that moved everyone present, but it also revealed the cruel reality of the situation. Eleanor was clearly in an advanced stage of dementia, unable to care for herself, let alone a 4-year-old child. "Grandma, I was so scared," Amethyst sobbed, "but Mr. Arthur helped me. He's good, like you said good people were." Eleanor looked at Arthur with eyes that momentarily regained their clarity. "You took care of my girl?" "I did," he replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "She has a special gift," Eleanor whispered, holding Arthur's hand with surprising strength. "The stones speak to her, as they spoke to me and my mother before me. It's an ancient line, sir, very ancient." Dr. Cardoso, the physician in charge of Eleanor, spoke privately with Arthur and Fiona about the prognosis. The dementia was progressing rapidly, and the woman would need full-time specialized care. There was no way she could resume custody of Amethyst. "And now what?" asked Iris, who had been visibly shaken by witnessing the reunion between grandmother and granddaughter. "Now we continue to care for her," Arthur said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Amethyst needs stability, and Eleanor needs proper treatment." That night, back in Asheville, an exhausted Amethyst slept in the guest room of Arthur's mansion, which had been hastily prepared for her. Iris had stayed for dinner, something that hadn't happened in months, and father and daughter had the most honest conversation they had shared since her divorce. "Dad, I need to admit something," Iris said, swirling the wine she had barely touched. "When I saw you with that girl today, when I saw how she looked at you with such trust, I remembered how I used to look at you when I was a child, before I became this bitter, controlling person." "Iris, no, let me finish. I projected my pain over losing Thomas onto you taking responsibility for Amethyst. But the truth is, I'm jealous. Jealous of how you managed to open your heart again while I've closed myself off in work and anger." Arthur reached out and touched his daughter's arm. "It's never too late to start over." "Maybe not," she said, looking toward the room where Amethyst was sleeping. "Maybe this special girl can teach us both a few lessons." But neither Arthur nor Iris imagined that Amethyst's drawings and Eleanor's words about ancient lineages were about to trigger discoveries that would change not only their personal lives, but also the course of the family business and the secrets buried in the mountains of North Carolina. 3 weeks later, life in the Blackwood mansion had completely transformed. Amethyst ran through the halls with the natural joy of a child who finally felt safe, while Iris discovered to her own surprise that she had dormant maternal instincts that the girl's presence had awakened. Arthur watched these changes with a mixture of joy and growing concern, as there were pending issues he couldn't ignore. On that Tuesday morning, Clayton Fisher, Arthur's partner for 15 years, arrived at the company office with a proposal that would have tempted any struggling entrepreneur. Clayton was a seemingly trustworthy man of 52 who had helped expand Blackwood Gems to 3 stores in different cities. "Arthur, we need to talk about a unique opportunity," Clayton said, spreading contracts across the mahogany desk. "I have international buyers interested in acquiring our entire collection of raw amethysts. The offered price is 3 times the market value." Arthur examined the documents with skepticism. 3 times the market price? That makes no business sense, Clayton. What kind of buyer pays that much? "Private European collectors. They value the American provenance and are willing to pay a premium for exclusivity." Clayton avoided Arthur's direct gaze. "But we need to close today. They have other options on the table." Something in Clayton's urgent tone made Arthur uncomfortable. In 3 decades in the business, he had learned to distrust deals that seemed too good to be true. "I'll review it carefully and give you an answer tomorrow." "Arthur, you don't understand." Clayton's mask of cordiality began to slip. "The company is facing financial difficulties that you refuse to see. These last few months you've been distracted by other matters. We need this money." "What difficulties?" Arthur sat up straight in his chair. "Our books are in order." "Are they?" Clayton laughed bitterly. "When was the last time you personally checked our inventory? When did you verify if the stones in our display cases are really what they seem to be?" A chill ran down Arthur's spine. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about 3 months of selling fake amethysts mixed with the real ones. I'm talking about customers who have started to question the authenticity of their purchases. I'm talking about a company that is about to face lawsuits for fraud." Arthur felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. You mixed fake stones into our inventory." "I was trying to save this company." Clayton slammed his fist on the table. "You disappeared emotionally after your wife died, and I kept everything running. But costs went up, competition grew, and you kept living in the past. So you decided to destroy 30 years of reputation." Arthur's voice trembled with restrained anger. "I decided to do what was necessary to survive, and now we have a chance to get out of this without destroying everything. Accept the buyer's offer, take the money, and we start over." Arthur stood up slowly. his mind processing the devastating implications of what he had just discovered. It wasn't just the betrayal of a longtime partner that shocked him, but the realization that his emotional negligence had contributed to this situation. "Get out of my company," he said in a low but firm voice. "Now! Arthur, be reasonable. Get out!" That afternoon, Arthur drove home in a state of shock. How had he allowed his company, the legacy of a lifetime's work, to come to the brink of ruin? How had he not noticed the sabotage happening right under his nose? When he arrived at the mansion, he found Amethyst in the garden, playing with the pebbles she collected during her daily walks with Iris. The girl looked up and immediately sensed that something was wrong. "Mr. Arthur is sad," she said, dropping her stones and running to hug his legs. Arthur knelt and hugged the girl, feeling a wave of emotion threaten to overwhelm him. "I am, little one. Sometimes adults do bad things that make other adults very sad. Like the bad man who made Grandma cry." Arthur pulled back slightly to look into Amethyst's eyes. "What bad man, dear?" "The one who came in the big car and talked roughly about Grandma's stones. He had eyes like a mean snake, not like the guardian snakes. Grandma always cried after he left." A terrible suspicion began to form in Arthur's mind. "Amethyst, do you remember what this man looked like?" The girl closed her eyes, concentrating. "He had dark hair and wore shiny clothes. He used hard words to confuse Grandma, and he had a strange mark on his hand." "What kind of mark?" Amethyst ran inside the house and returned with one of her drawings. With a purple crayon, she drew a hand with a crescent-shaped scar on the palm. Arthur felt his blood run cold. He knew that scar. Clayton had told him years ago about a childhood accident that had left that mark. Just then, Iris arrived home from work and immediately noticed the tension in the air. "Dad, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," Arthur told her about the conversation with Clayton and the devastating suspicion that was forming. Iris listened in growing silence, her face paling with each revelation. "Dad, if Clayton was exploiting prospectors like Amethyst's grandmother, that means that our company may have benefited from stones obtained through exploitation," Arthur completed, feeling sick, "and that I was too blind to see it." But it was Amethyst who offered the solution that neither of them had considered. "Mr. Arthur, Grandma hid the most beautiful stones where the bad man never looked. She showed me the secret place. Maybe Grandma's stones can help you be less sad." Over the next week, Arthur made the toughest decisions of his business life. He pressed criminal charges against Clayton, temporarily closed the stores for a complete inventory audit, and faced the real possibility of bankruptcy. But he also did something he never thought possible. He allowed a 4-year-old girl to guide him to an abandoned mine in the mountains near Hawk's Peak. The place Amethyst led them to was exactly as her drawings had shown, an old excavation surrounded by natural rock formations and dominated by a century-old tulip poplar. There, in underground chambers that Eleanor had dug out over years, they discovered the largest concentration of gem-quality amethysts Arthur had ever seen. "Grandma said this land belonged to our family for a long, long time," Amethyst explained, reverently touching the crystalline walls. "She was saving the stones for when I grew up and could take care of them properly." The discovery changed everything. With the help of specialized lawyers, Arthur managed to prove that Eleanor held the legal rights to that property, inherited from her ancestors who had been the first prospectors in the region. The Amethysts found there were more than enough to save the company, pay off all debts, and still establish a substantial fund for Eleanor's treatment. More importantly, the authenticity and quality of the stones allowed Arthur to rebuild the reputation of Blackwood Gems on solid, ethical foundations. But the biggest transformation was not financial. During the 6-month process of legalizing Amethyst's permanent custody, Arthur discovered capacities for love and protection he had lost years ago. Iris found renewed purpose in helping to raise a child who saw the world with magical eyes, and Amethyst gained not only a family, but the security of knowing that her origins and her story were valued and preserved. One December afternoon, 9 months after that first encounter on the dusty road, Arthur signed the final adoption papers for Amethyst. The girl, now 5 and much more talkative, solemnly watched the legal procedure that would officially make her part of the Blackwood family. "Now you're my daughter forever," Arthur said, picking her up. "And you're my daddy forever," Amethyst replied, hugging him tightly. "Grandma Eleanor said that free birds always find the right nest." Iris, who had become a dedicated and protective older sister, smiled through tears. And sometimes the right nest finds the birds. That day, they established the Eleanor Blackwood Fund for Vulnerable Children, financed by the ethical sale of the amethysts. It was a way to honor the woman who had guarded treasures of stone and wisdom, passed down through generations to a brave little girl who had saved the life of a lost man. Arthur never again drove down that road without feeling gratitude for the snake that had forced him to stop, for the girl who had the courage to shoo it away, and for the circumstances that brought Amethyst into his life when they both needed healing the most. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you so much.